Hi everyone, this is Elizabeth Orline from the National Health Council. We are very excited for our webinar today. We will be hearing from Dory Kranz, who's the CEO of the National Alopecia Areata Foundation, on lessons learned from developing a PRO measure, the experience of one patient advocacy group. As many of you are aware, the National Health Council has our patient groups in membership, and we are preparing this series to help bring the patient community in particular up to speed on clinical outcome assessments because it's such an important topic in FDA's patient-focused drug development program. So here we'll review the agenda. First, we'll go over the objectives. Then I will introduce Dory Kranz, our speaker today. She will go over a preview of the lessons learned in developing, they're about midway through developing a PRO measure, why a PRO measure is needed, and some other topics. Then at the end, we will have a question and answer period and introduce our June topic. Before we get started, I wanted to just review a few housekeeping items. Everybody besides us at the NHC and our speaker will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. If you have a question that you'd like to submit, please go ahead and submit it through the chat function, and we will be taking all of those questions at the end. So again, the objective for today's webinar is to introduce to a patient group audience the experience of a patient advocacy group that is currently developing a patient-reported outcome measure. And we wanted to just quickly review again where PROs are in the context of clinical outcome assessment. So an FDA definition of a COA, or clinical outcome assessment, is something that measures a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effects of a disease or condition on how well the patient functions. So in simpler terms, a COA tells you something about how a patient feels or functions. And there are a couple of different measures under the COA umbrella. Patient-reported outcome measures are just one. There are also clinician-reported outcome measures, CLIN-ROs, observer-reported outcome measures, OBS-ROs, and performance outcome measures, PERFOs. And we've introduced this terminology in past webinars that are available recorded on the National Health Council's website. I wanted to remind everybody that not all patient-centered outcomes are patient-reported outcomes, and not all patient-reported outcomes are necessarily patient-centered. This is the topic of our November webinar from 2018, but it's just important to keep at the front of everyone's mind is that the things that patients tell us are important may or may not be best captured through a patient-reported outcome. They might be better captured through a clinical measure or other type of COA. So with that in mind, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Dory Kranz is CEO of the National Alopecia Areata Foundation, NAAF. NAAF works to integrate the voice of people living with alopecia areata, disease experience experts, into all aspects of research so that treatments that are developed are meaningful to them. In addition to incorporating disease experience experts in the review process for research grants, NAAF is spearheading a consortium process to develop a patient-reported outcome measure tool for use in clinical trials of potential treatments for this autoimmune disease that results in hair loss and often emotional pain. So Dory, I will turn it over to you now, and we're excited to get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Eleanor and Silke and Elizabeth and everybody at the National Health Council for this opportunity to share some of what we're learning through an exciting and also challenging process of developing an instrument to measure what matters to patients so that treatments in development meet the patient needs. And I also just want to thank the National Health Council for their overall leadership in patient engagement and providing opportunities for us to learn from each other through forums like this about how things work in the real world. So thank you, guys. And I'll start and end with the key takeaways so far. As I think it was Elizabeth mentioned, we're about halfway through the process. So these are lessons that we're learning and we're not yet done. And the first of those lessons is that it takes a significant amount of time and resources. I had no idea when we began this that it would be a years-long process at over $500,000 worth of investment. So I would say if you don't know up front that you're going to be able to set yourself up to do it right, that I wouldn't take it on. There were two essential things that I feel enabled us to take this on in a way that I do believe we're going to be successful. And one is that we got board buy-in from the NAF. We call NAAF, we just call it NAF, so that's how I'll refer to us. We got buy-in from the board of NAF right at the beginning. And I'll explain later how I don't think we could have done this without that. And we also selected a clinical outcome assessment consultant, a partner that does clinical outcome assessment measure development. And we chose a partner that was trusted both by the FDA and by industry. So that was important. And there have been tremendous opportunities to build relationships and educate both the FDA and beyond the FDA. And so if you're going to do this, I would say look for and utilize all of those opportunities because that has been a value that we didn't expect going in. And we've also been able to leverage existing expertise. The International Dermatology Outcome Measures Group, IDIOM, they've been helpful in pointing us to the importance of this because in psoriasis, for instance, they did not try and create one instrument at the beginning, and they're now trying to harmonize 15 different instruments. CPATH, a nonprofit, the National Health Council, other nonprofits on this journey, we're trying not to reinvent the wheel, but to leverage experience that's already out there. And I would also, we have just found everything takes longer than you can imagine. And so we made a commitment at the beginning to continue good science, to continue doing the good work to develop the measure from the voice of the patient, despite all of the bureaucratic delays that are coming at us from all sides. So those are the previews of lessons learned, and I'll go through a little more detail if you could go to the next slide. And the first thing we needed to determine and convince our board of especially was why a PRO measure was needed. So there already existed 3 alopecia areata specific patient-reported outcome instruments, but there were gaps in the development of those and the latest FDA guidance. So those other instruments were developed from existing instruments by clinicians and researchers, not starting with the patient voice. And the FDA is requiring that it starts with the patient voice and that there is a patient-reported outcome measure as part of the clinical trial endpoint. And the FDA doesn't require that the patient-reported instrument be patient-centered, but we, NAF, a patient advocacy group, care very much that it is both patient-reported and patient-centered. And then there are available generic instruments that are designed for all of dermatology or all of hair loss, but they're likely to be insufficient to support product labeling claims. Industry cares about these tools because when they put the their drug through FDA approval process, the end result is that they get to say something on their label about the benefit of the drug. And so we want an instrument that is going to enable the industry partners to get what they need in the end, which is a labeling claim. And also, these generic instruments were developed without starting with the patient voice. So in addition to new FDA guidelines, the Patient Drug User Fee Act and the 21st Century Cures Act require enhanced inclusion of patients throughout the instrument development process. And we believe this is going to be useful in clinical trials, but in addition, it's going to be useful collecting real-world evidence after drugs are in the market for comparative effectiveness research and things like precision medicine and shared decision-making, where understanding what works best in each individual and based on their values, behaviors, molecular and genetic profile, and medical history, what treatments make sense for them. And so we see a long road where a standard instrument will be helpful. Next slide. So why is it needed now? In particular, in alopecia areata, clinical trials are just starting for treatments directed to alopecia areata. Right now, there are no treatments approved by the FDA for alopecia areata specifically. And as I mentioned quickly in the lessons learned preview, we want to avoid a situation like psoriasis is in now, where they're trying to harmonize 15 different instruments, 15 years down the treatment development road. So they have many drugs in the market, but their comparative effectiveness research is difficult, and pointing to precision medicine is difficult because they're not measuring the effect with the same tool. There is no instrument to measure what matters to patients that can be used as a clinical co-primary or key secondary endpoint right now. And since clinical trials are happening, that's the instrument that we want to develop, something that's sensitive enough to pick up a change in the perceived benefit to a patient over the course of a clinical trial, 3 to 6 months' time. As you were told at the beginning, there are a number of different clinical outcome assessments. A patient-reported outcome is one. A clinician-reported outcome is another. And the clinician-reported endpoint that's currently used in alopecia areata looks at the percent of scalp with missing hair. And doctors and researchers declare it a success when that measure goes from 60% of the scalp missing hair to 30% of the scalp missing hair. But a patient still needs to wear a wig, so that's not really a win from the patient perspective. So as these clinical trials are being developed, we, NAF, the patient advocacy group, wants to understand what matters to patients and what's acceptable to the FDA for qualification as a clinical outcome assessment drug development tool for use in clinical trials, and in this case, what we're working on is a patient-reported outcome tool. Next slide. And the FDA acknowledges the need for this instrument to be developed. In their response to our letter of inquiry to put this tool into the drug development tool qualification process, they said there is a lack of fit-for-purpose patient-reported outcome instruments in alopecia areata. So we feel it's important, industry feels it's important, and the FDA feels it's important now. So next slide. Why did we do this as an industry consortium instead of NAF just taking on funding the development of this? Well, first of all, there's shared investment and value. There's value to NAF and there's value to the industry partners. It will cost less for each company if they pool their money through us and do it together. And frankly, NAF could not afford to fund this on our own. It's over $500,000 easily. We're not quite sure how far over that it's going to go. But, you know, our budget is around $2 million. So that's way out of our range. We also think there's benefit to industry, and they agree with us on this, that our third-party neutrality is a positive indication that the tool we come up with is really going to serve patients, not serve any particular company. We, NAF, have recognition and reach within the patient community, which has meant it's been easy for us to get participants, to get that patient voice when we need it quickly. We have patient credibility, patient engagement credibility with the FDA. And we, NAF, benefit from the industry expertise about navigating the FDA and getting our message and our questions to the right people. And then industry and patients will both benefit from a single standardized metric for eventual comparative effectiveness research, as I mentioned the psoriasis example. So next slide. Our objective is to have a single evidence-based patient-reported outcome measure for alopecia areata for qualification as a drug development tool to support medical product approval, labeling claims, and real-world evidence. Next slide. So all of the people in the consortium, I mentioned the industry partners, but up at the top middle of this circle are the patients themselves, or what we like to call disease experience experts. Then moving to the right, there's NAF, the patient advocacy group. We do have 3 biopharmaceutical industry partners now, the FDA, key opinion leaders in alopecia areata treatment and research, and then the clinical outcome assessment, patient-reported outcome consulting partner, Evidera. So that's the whole group that we're working with. Next slide. So now that I've told you why we're doing it, I'll tell you where we are in the PRO measure development process. Next slide. There's 3 phases. The first phase are what are called concept elicitation interviews. This is where we ask open-ended questions of patients about what bothers them about living with alopecia areata. And through those interviews, we identify the concepts that are important to people with alopecia areata, and that informs our measure development. And I don't know if you remember the example of the myelofibrosis drug, that the blood cancer drug that initially the company thought was going to measure benefit patients by reducing the size of their spleen. So they did a trial, and their patient-reported outcome was spleen size, and that the patients didn't show any benefit from reduced spleen size. So then they went back and asked something else, and eventually they asked patients what matters, and patients said bloating and discomfort. So then they developed a measure to get the change on bloating and discomfort, and that did show a benefit to patients, and then the drug was approved by the FDA. So we want to get our bloating and discomfort, we want to know that up front so companies don't have to go through more than 1 round of trials in order to get the drugs approved if they're actually showing benefits to patients. So phase 2, once we've elicited those concepts, once we've figured out what matters to alopecia areata patients, then we have to develop questions that try and elicit information about that issue that matters and test those questions with other people with alopecia areata and say, are these questions understandable? Are these issues important to you? And are there any concepts that are important that are missing? So that's what we find out in Phase 2, and we're coming to the end of Phase 2 now. And in Phase 3, we will look at the psychometric properties, a more scientific look, and validate the instrument in a clinical trial. And so that we have yet to do. So as I said, it takes significant time and resources. So if you could go to the next slide. This is our sort of diagram of what we thought we would be doing between Q1 2017 and what we thought was going to be the beginning of 2019. And I don't expect you to look at everything on this, but it just gives you a sense of Q1 2017. We were beginning with the concept elicitation interviews, that blue box, and then that happened all the way through 2017 and part of 2018, and then we began the cognitive debriefing, and then we thought we would be doing the validation starting in the fall of 2018, and I'm not even sure we're going to be doing that by the fall of 2019. So it's just taking longer than we expected. Next slide. So in the lessons learned, I mentioned that getting board buy-in first was really critical. So we knew that we needed to invest something in getting this started before industry would sign contracts for support, because we had been talking to industry partners and getting excited nods of interest about wanting to participate, but when it came down to the contracts, until we were in contract with the clinical outcome assessment patient-reported outcome consultant, industry wasn't signing contracts with us. So we went to our board to get their buy-in for us to begin investing before we secured industry support. And we had already trained our board in patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research before deciding to take on this patient-reported outcome consortium process. And that training that we used to train our board, we developed from materials that were developed at the University of Maryland and NORD. And they were publicly available, and we found out about them through Elena Perfetto, who helped to create them. So this is one of those times where not reinventing the wheel and looking to what expertise is available through resources like the National Health Council really helped us take a giant step forward. And with those materials, we then went to PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and said, we want to take these already existing materials and tailor them to alopecia areata, and won a patient engagement grant of $160,000 to develop that training and deliver it to a group in our community that we call Health and Research Ambassadors. And so we had developed and given that training when it came time to educate our board and get their buy-in. So it kind of all dovetailed really nicely. And we made the case to the board that industry is interested, but they're not buying in until the work is underway. And that happened in February of 2017. And the board said, yes, but will you please design the contract with the clinical outcome assessment patient-reported outcome consultant partner with exit points to control the risk to NAF if we're unable to secure enough industry partnership to do the whole thing. So that's what we did. And next slide. That buy-in from the board allowed us to engage a clinical outcome assessment PRO consulting firm, and we did choose one that was trusted by the FDA and industry. And we had to do this because NAF does not have the expertise to create a PRO measure. We're not scientists, and we don't have the time. It's an incredibly time-consuming. We're a staff of 8, so we couldn't take this on. We needed a partner for the expertise and the time. And the clinical outcome assessment PRO firms do this kind of work, we also found that they refer to themselves sometimes as health economics outcome research firms. But we selected Evidera, and they were trusted by our potential industry partners and by the FDA, and they had demonstrated this by previous success in working on other measures with these new FDA guidelines of starting from the voice of the patient. And so our contract with Evidera was signed in May of 2017, and that did include exit points if we failed to secure enough funding to do the whole project. So we had to put about $150,000 on the line before we knew any money was coming in. So that was kind of a big, I have to give our board credit for being really courageous in saying yes to that. So then after we engaged the firm, we went on to secure industry partners. Next slide. We went back to those people who had smiled at us and said, we're very excited about this, and said, now we need your firm commitment in writing and the money. And that first firm industry sponsor commitment came in July of 2017. So that's 6 months after we first got the board to say we would invest in this and move forward. And we had been in discussions, as I said, since November of 2016. So if we were faint of heart or weren't really committed to this, it would have been dropped long since. And our 3 industry partners as of May 2019 now, we have Leo, Aclaris, and Lilly. So we're really delighted to be working with them in this endeavor. And so next slide. Where we are in the process is in the 3rd column, the red circle showing initial briefing package to the FDA. So we have done 1 initial briefing package to the FDA back in November of 2018 and got some informal feedback that they had questions about some things. And in that feedback to us, they suggested that we get in touch with a group called CPATH and for further assistance in making sure the instrument was going to be trusted by the FDA. And this feedback, this informal feedback, and eventually getting in touch with CPATH has really helped us, a patient advocacy group who are not experts in developing instruments, to understand the importance of a good instrument and what makes a good instrument so that we can take our commitment and understanding of what the patients are telling us and create an instrument that's actually going to be useful. So next slide. Just give you a little bit more detail about what happens in these different phases. In the concept elicitation phase, we interviewed 30 adults and 12 adolescents, and this was all before we got the first industry sponsorship. These interviewees were recruited through NAF as well as through 5 clinical sites, so we wouldn't skew the results to the people who find NAF who may have different issues than people who don't find NAF. And the reason we included adolescents is that we know that for our disease, almost half of people are diagnosed in adolescence, and we know that industry wants to be able to include adolescents in their trials. So we talked to the FDA, and they said, yeah, if you do the concept elicitation, if you do the whole process with adults and adolescents and look at their data separately and can prove to us that what matters to them is the same, then you can have 1 instrument. In terms of FDA engagement during the concept elicitation phase, we had 2 what are called CPIM calls, Critical Path Innovation Meetings, and these calls had a really deep FDA bench involved in them. So it was a wonderful education opportunity for us to educate them on a disease that many of the people at the FDA did not understand well. And so we were in front of 12 people from 4 offices within the FDA, including the clinical outcome assessment people, the people in the Office of Drug Evaluation, Derm and Dental, who are the people who approve drugs for alopecia areata, their Director Kendall Marcus and Deputy Director Jill Lindstrom, and 2 other medical officers, people from the Office of Translational Sciences, the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives, Teresa Mullen. These were relationship building and education opportunities with the FDA. And we were on the calls, NAF, but so were our industry partners, 10 people from 3 countries. And one of our industry partners suggested an example of a patient-reported outcome instrument that they thought would be a good type for us to develop. And that was for Kybella, which is a chin fat drug that they call it submental fat that hangs down under some people's chins. And for that patient-reported outcome measure, they had a primary satisfaction question that was used as the key secondary endpoint in the clinical trial. And then they had additional clarifying questions on subsatisfaction and impact on activities in life. And so the FDA told us that they are open to that same kind of instrument for alopecia areata. And we wouldn't have known to ask that question without the expertise of our industry partners. And our key concepts were identified in this concept elicitation phase, and we drafted a measure with questions about those key concepts. And we submitted in June of 2018 to the FDA for their feedback on that draft measure. And their written comments to us in August of 2018 included the suggestion that we contact CPATH. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But I just want you to notice that we submitted to the FDA at the beginning of June, and we heard back from them in the end of August. And so the months-long, 3 to 6 months, seems to be the time for any back and forth with the FDA. And this is, they tell us they're doing it quickly because we're a nonprofit health advocacy organization. So I feel very much for the people that they do it slowly for. Anyway, second phase, cognitive debriefing. Next slide, thank you. So we went back to 20 adults and 10 adolescents. And at this point, we had 2 additional industry sponsors. And this was to share with them the instrument that we had developed and look at the qualitative and quantitative properties of the instrument. Are the items clear? Do you understand what this question is asking? How do you interpret the question? Is it easy to complete? Is it comprehensive? Are all the things that bother you about alopecia areata, all the important things captured here? And do the response scales make sense? And is the recall period something that you can actually think about and answer the question? If we, do we say, how do you feel about the hair on your head right now versus over the last week? That kind of thing. And so all of these are why we have the clinical outcome assessment PRO consultant helping us, because we're not up to the task of making sure all this is done correctly. So then we submitted again in October of 2018 on all of the data we had collected thus far during the initial interviews, the concept elicitation interviews, and also what we were finding in the cognitive debriefing interviews. And they and we requested a call. Right when we submitted that data, we requested a call on the same day because we have found out if we wait to hear from them and then request a call, then if the time frame is just longer. So then we had that call on January 29th. And in the meantime, we had enrolled a CPAP advisory team. And CPAP is a nonprofit that is designed to give advice in a pre-competitive neutral ground, and that's what we're trying to do with this, with industry, pre-competitive neutral ground, something everybody's going to need. And a lot of people at CPAP used to actually work in the clinical outcome assessment group at the FDA. So their advice is free to us, and they can help translate what we're trying to make sure that matters to patients that gets in the instrument. They can translate that into FDA speak about what's going to work in an instrument or not. So it's been an incredible education, I will say. And so we have had 3 calls with the CPAP team since. And once again, I think the instrument is becoming stronger because of all this back and forth. I just wish it could go more quickly. So we have refined the PRO measure based on both the cognitive interviews and the FDA feedback and our conversations with CPAP. And we requested informal feedback from the FDA on this refined measure in April last month, and we have not yet heard back for scheduling. We haven't even gotten an acknowledgement that they received our request. So it's an interesting system in which to exist. But all of these questions with the phone calls with the FDA and with the CPAP team, our industry partners have been able to be part of. And so they've told us that that's an unprecedented amount of access for them to what the FDA is thinking. And so at least that has value, even though it's taking a long time. So this is where we are at the end of phase 2. Next slide. We hope to get to the psychometric properties, to be able to look at those properties and do the validation in a clinical trial. I'm not going to tell you much more about this because I can't explain it in detail because we haven't done it yet. But I will say that we're excited about the potential to submit for drug development tool qualification of this PRO in adults and adolescents. And so we really hope the validation will include both age groups, and we know there are trials going on that do include both age groups. So we're excited about that. Next slide. And I'm just about done. So the biggest challenge was coordinating with slow-moving bureaucracies in big organizations. We are small. There's 8 of us. We don't have a legal team. We don't even have a legal person. And so when the FDA is taking an average of 6 months to schedule a meeting or provide feedback, and the biopharmaceutical companies are taking a minimum of 3 months of legal wrangling once we even say, yes, we want to do this, and we're in contracting. And this is all of this slow-moving bureaucracy is in the context of urgency because these industry partners need the PRO measure to meet their clinical trial schedules. So it's kind of nerve-wracking, but we're just continuing to do good science in the face of all this. We're just continuing to do the work. And then I just wanted to say a little bit about the benefits. Next slide. Being an above-brand industry collaboration benefits both industry and the patients because NAP couldn't have done this without the industry collaborators. And I think that the drugs that are in development will be more beneficial to patients with this tool measuring that change. And a standard instrument across all trials, as I said, is going to be good for eventual comparative effectiveness research. We hope at some point soon we're going to have many drugs in the market that we get to compare and figure out what works best in what kind of person. The building relationships with the FDA and educating them about alopecia areata has been invaluable for NAF, for the FDA, and for the industry partners. As I said, the industry partners have said they've had way more interaction with the FDA than they otherwise would, and so that's terrific. And it's been a platform to talk about alopecia areata treatment development and patient engagement broadly, like what we're doing today. So one more slide. The opportunities to educate the FDA started with the letter of intent in March of 2017, which had tremendous information about the disease burden and the need for a treatment. And so that was an educational opportunity. The 2 critical path innovation meetings where we had calls with lots of people from lots of FDA branches, with the deep FDA bench. The 2 patient-reported outcome progress submissions, those also contained information about the disease burden, and the 2 informal feedback calls. And then in the course of this, we also had a patient-focused drug development meeting in September of 2017, and that all dovetailed nicely. And then the opportunities to educate a broader audience through presentations include things like the webinar that we're on today. I was able to present at the NIH with 5 institutes in April of just last month about this, and that came about because I presented at the Pediatric Dermatology Research Alliance, PEDRA, in October of 2018. And people are interested in this process because it's kind of on the cutting edge of patient engagement, but in the process of that, we're also educating the whole community about alopecia areata and the need for treatment. And it was kind of fun at the National Health Council Chief Medical and Scientific Officer Conference in November of 2017. I was on a panel with Teresa Mullen of the FDA and talking about this work as well as the PFDD meeting. And I've seen her 5 or 6 times before in different settings. And this was the first time that she clearly recognized me and came up to me and said, wow, this work that you're doing with the PFDD meeting and the patient-focused work is fantastic. And so some message is getting out there in a good way. And just a little aside about taking advantage of these informal opportunities, at the International Dermatology Outcome Measures meeting in May of 2017, I presented on this idea before we were even fully started. And Kendall Marcus, who heads up Derm and Dental Drug Evaluation at FDA, and Electra Papadopoulos of the Clinical Outcome Assessments Group were both in the audience at that meeting and came up to me afterward and provided informal feedback on the one critical path innovation meeting call we had already had, and how to leverage the upcoming patient-focused drug development meeting to move the FDA education and get buy-in on the PRO consortium. And so you just never know what how you're going to benefit from getting the word out about what you're doing with engaging patients in meaningful ways. So the lessons learned, I'm just going to remind you, it takes significant time and resources. $500,000 or more, and that does not count staff time. I will say that we have brought in $510,000 so far from industry sponsors, and we expect more to come. So it has been a net benefit to NAF just on the hard dollars by a little bit. Those 2 essentials, board buy-in at the beginning and a clinical outcome assessment patient-reported outcome consultant partner that's trusted by FDA and industry, utilizing opportunities to build relationships and educate the FDA and the broader audience, and leveraging existing expertise, IDIOM, CPAS, National Health Council, University of Maryland, NORD, anybody you can think of that's on this path before you. And everything takes longer than you can imagine. We hoped it was going to be a little over 2 years, and it's clear it's going to be somewhat over 3. But as I said, we're continuing the good science in the face of the bureaucratic delays. And we're hoping for a good result for the whole ecosystem. So thank you. And if anybody has any questions.
Great, thank you, Dory, so much. This was so informative and a really wonderful presentation. So just a reminder for everybody, if they have any questions that they would like to ask, please go ahead and type it into the chat function, and then I'll ask Dory the questions. Dory, we had a couple of questions come in. The first one was, what have you learned that would have made you do things differently than you did?
You mean if we were going to do it again, what would we do differently?
Exactly.
Yeah. It would have been better if we could have started earlier in the process when industry was designing the first clinical trial. We didn't know this was going to be needed, and so we missed an opportunity to engage with a number of industry partners on this because their need for the PRO was sooner than we could possibly have gotten it done. So I would have started earlier, but I don't know if we would have been able to get those partners anyway, because some of them are on such a fast track, and the combination of a consortium process and the way we wanted to develop the tool was never going to be as fast as some companies are able to do it on their own. So, but I would have started earlier.
Thank you. One additional question is, you mentioned that you had the patient-focused drug development meeting just before you set out developing the PRO. I was wondering, how did the PFDD meeting inform your work in PRO development?
So we knew that we were wanting to convince the board and get the industry buy-in to do the PRO work at the time the PFDD meeting finally got scheduled. So the meeting happened in September of 2017, and we found out the date in May. And as soon as we found out the date, we went out to our community with an IRB-approved survey asking the very questions that the FDA was going to ask at the PFDD meeting, some of which are about disease burden and what bothers people about living with alopecia areata. And so we figured we would get additional data for our public comments on the PFDD meeting, as well as getting additional data points to look at the concepts that came out of the concept elicitation interviews against a bigger data set. So we had about 700 responses to that survey, and we were able to use that in our submission to FDA, but we were also able to use it to, when the concepts were bubbling up from the open-ended questions that we asked people in our community, we could then go look at these other data points and say, did it come up here as well? And that continues to be useful. And so that's one place where they dovetailed. And then what was the specific thing? Were you asking how the PFDD affected the PRO, or the other way around?
I suppose it could go either way. The question was in the direction of how the PFDD meeting informs the work in PRO development, but if you have learnings in the other direction as well, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, so I think the other way the PFDD meeting informed and assisted in the PRO development consortium was that industry partners were in the audience at the PFDD meeting and saw some of the misinformation that was being put out by experts in the FDA about our disease, alopecia areata. And so it made, we got a couple more industry partners not long after that PFDD meeting, because they recognized even if the timeline was going to be too long for them to use the tool we developed in their first clinical trial, the opportunity to educate the FDA was too important to miss. So that helped us out a lot. And the fact that we were working on the patient-reported outcome measure and had enrolled the FDA in having a role with us in this development meant that my conversations with the FDA people at that PFDD meeting were very rich. And so it just helped them, each little thing helps them become more invested in helping us get treatments for this disease. We saw people at the FDA passing tissues around when the panels were talking at the PFDD meeting. That kind of opening of hearts is invaluable in their willingness to be as quick as they can and as helpful as they can to us in this drug development tool process. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dory. That's really helpful. We had one question come in, and I think it's just to clarify that the survey that you had alluded to where you had 700 responses, that was a survey that you had conducted based on the questions that FDA staff ask patients to respond to in the scope of a patient-focused drug development meeting. But that was independent of the work that you've been doing engaging patients as you develop the PRO measure.
Yeah, so that survey that I mentioned was specifically the questions that the FDA asks at the PFDD meeting. But some of them are related to what bothers people about living with alopecia areata. So it's useful data in the PRO concept elicitation process as well.
Great, thank you. And then one other question is in regards to how you're engaging clinicians in the process of developing the PRO measure.
So the clinicians are, we have key opinion leader clinicians that are part of our research advisory council, and then we also have a chief scientific officer who's an MD, PhD clinician researcher with a focus on alopecia areata. And at times when we have something that we're not sure how to word or what whether something would be measurable in the context of a clinical trial, then we ask those people who are the clinician researchers who work in the clinical trial setting and can say to us, you know, if you have, if each one of your answer sets, if the scale that you're using for 10 different questions, if it's a different scale for each of those 10 questions, you won't get good data because people can't process a different scale each time. You have to have, if you want to say sometimes, always, never, rarely, whatever, always use those same 5. Don't change the scales. And those are the kinds of things that the key opinion leaders, the clinician researchers, have been really helpful with. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Dory. And one more question, I guess it wouldn't have to be final if we received one more, is what have you learned that confirms that you are on the right track with this PRO measure? So as each time we go back and forth with the FDA, we learn something about a concept and its applicability across different genders, ages, ethnic categories, languages. Some things translate easily, some things don't. We expect that this is going to be used worldwide at some point, so we want to think ahead about translatability of both the concepts and the questions. And so each time we go back around and we learn more about how to make it, how to keep it faithful to what the patients care about, but how to make it an instrument that's going to be
broadly applicable and translatable, we are learning and in conversation with our community, developing trusting relationships about how we're helping clinical trials be likely to demonstrate their benefit to patients. It's just the fact that we keep learning, and as we're going back to our community, they're excited about this, and as we're talking with industry, they feel it's valuable, and as we're talking to the FDA, we're moving in the right direction. These all make me think we're doing the right thing and that it's going to have value.
Thank you, Dory. And just one final question is, you mentioned relying on a number of partners and individuals and organizations for their expertise, but one question was just if there are any other written resources that you would recommend for other patient groups to take a look at before developing a measure or thinking about going down this path.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that made us believe early on that we had to hire a clinical outcome assessment patient-reported outcome partner to do this was because we initially tried to go through the hundreds of page-long FDA guidance to see if we could do this ourselves. And I just have to say that wading through that document was just, it just was crushing. So I think that the FDA does not write things in a way that's easy for non-FDA savvy scientists to understand what they're supposed to do if they wanted to try and do it themselves. So I didn't find any written documents. I thought that the UMD NORD training on patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research was helpful, and I haven't gone back since we're 2 years into the process to see if there's anything now that's written out that would be helpful, but I didn't find anything when I was looking 2.5 years ago.
Great, thank you, Dory. Well, we will be posting these slides on the National Health Council's website. So I think this will be a really important resource for other patient groups as they consider going down this path or if they're already starting to go down the path of developing a patient-reported outcome measure or other measures. So I really, really appreciate you presenting today. I also wanted to announce our topic for our June COA webinar. It will be on June 10th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic is what is the difference between health-related quality of life and patient-reported outcomes? And it will be featuring Lori Burke. And I also wanted to remind everybody that if you have suggestions for a topic that you'd like to see us cover as part of our webinar series, that we do have a survey on our website, and you're welcome to just go on there and submit any topic of interest. And I would like to just thank everybody for participating today and thank Dory so much for presenting today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks. Bye-bye.